Thank you for coming here. I'm so happy to talk with you about our joint research. Today, I'd like to discuss about the sustainable property market. And we would like to focus on the ESG or SDGs and the property market today. In property investment market, attention to environment, society, and governance or ESG has increased. In the 21st century, interest in global warming has increased, and various efforts have been made towards realizing the high sustainable society. And the carbon emissions from the construction and the real estate sector are significant at both the construction and the operation stages. Efforts to reduce them are urgently required. Under such circumstances, the United Nations advocated the responsible property investment principle and has instilled ESG compliance in the property market through the both financing and investment in financial functions. However, the response of each country is different. It can be said that ESG effort in the early days depended on the sympathy for the global problems. However, although I acknowledge the importance of the ESG, goodwill and the sympathy did not become drivers until the construction, management, and investment behavior of the property are changed. In the second decade of the 21st century, the onset of the Biden administration in the United States triggered a major shift in Japan toward a low carbon or carbon-free society. Prior to that, in the field of property investment, in response to increasing demand from the institutional investors, such as pension funds, to comply with ESG norms, consideration of the environment and the information disclosures has been rapidly promoted. The high cost of the generating or disclosing such information results in the loss of some of the return on investment for investors seeking to maximize this parameter. This raises the question, what do investors demand ESG consideration from asset managers? I was supporting to the pension fund, GPIS, and other big pension fund as an advisor. As you know, my research area of the expertise is not the environmental economics or property finance. This is an economic measurement. Property has been considered the most difficult target to measure due to its high heterogeneity. Thus, I have studied the property price index. Additionally, the environment, which includes the green, is also very difficult to measure. This is my motivation to do research related to the green premiums in the property market. Okay, and the importance of the realizing of low carbon society is broadly recognized. To achieve this, it is expected that increasing the proactive effort will be undertaken on the global scale. The property market and the construction sector are considerably important in the realization of the low carbon society. In the future, initiatives to realize low carbon society are expected is increased and the activity adopted on the global scale. In this situation, the role of the property market continue to increase. I first met you at the New Leader Conference and on the Isle of Skye, Scotland. Professor Hendershot, who is a pioneer in the real estate economics, invited young researchers from each continent who are predicted to become future leaders in the real estate economics field or real estate finance. Fortunately, we were invited to the meeting, both you and I, were teaching at the different university at that time. You were teaching at the Reading University. I'm teaching at the Lake Park University, very small university. Young researchers who had gathered there have now become professors. Christian Hilbert, he's working at the London School of Economics. And Tiwari-san, Mr. Tiwari is working at the University of Melbourne. And Pat is working at the Reading, no? Reading University?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And Mark Frank is working at the University of Amsterdam. So maybe actually, and I'm very impressed by the Professor Hendershot foresight. And you are reporting research on the green property market at that time. And maybe I think you are a pioneer of this field. So what inspired and motivated you to start research in this area in the early part of the 2000s? Please.
Thanks, Jero. And let me just say, it's a real pleasure to be here. And you very eloquently pointed out the history of this and how we met quite a long time ago. And it's a real pleasure to continue to work with you, especially on a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, which is sustainable property and sustainable property markets. Now, to answer your question, what motivated me to get into this line of research? And I think it's a little bit to do with my background, which is originally in urban and regional planning and economics. So those are two things that I find fascinating. So starting with really the built environment and buildings. And I've always been fascinated with buildings and how they shape our lives, our behavior, the way we feel. So buildings really take a central role, I think, in almost anyone's lives, right? So thinking back to our childhoods, our memories, a lot of it is connected intimately to buildings and the built environment and the natural environment, of course. So to almost anyone, that's a huge factor in my life. So and in anyone's life and in my life. At the same time, then the next question is what shapes these buildings and built environments? And I think I've come to the conclusion that on top of this list, or very near the top, is economic and financial factors, right? There's also design, there's culture, obviously, there's the climate that we're in, all those things, but economics really plays a role. So I don't think you can understand buildings and the way they shape us without understanding the economics behind it. And it was this kind of interaction between the two that, and the intersection of the two, that keeps me interested in it. So not just looking at real estate as a purely financial asset like any other asset class, but also not just looking at it from a purely design perspective. And I think once you put these two elements together, you very quickly arrive at sustainability and how you and all the questions revolving around sustainability. Because a lot of our contemporary problems, let's face it, are having to do with a lack of sustainability. That's where a lot of problems arise. Obviously, climate change being the biggest one, but also quite a few economic and financial problems that are getting more and more. So that's basically the stage that I would like to set. But the very narrow start of my research interest was that, well, about 13, 14 years ago, for the first time, you really had good enough data to actually do some empirical testing on these things, where meaning the economics of green labels and green buildings, and whether there's actually something like a win-win situation where you have both better outcomes in terms of the environmental footprint of a building, but also be able to demonstrate a kind of a green real estate business case that this makes sense. So this is not just as it's been seen in previous time, a kind of a contribution to society, almost like a donation that an investor makes, but it also makes good business sense.
Yeah.
And I wasn't out at the time, and I'm still not out to convert anyone or say or demonstrate something that isn't there. So I'm pretty agnostic when it comes to this. I'm a researcher first and foremost, and I want to test hypotheses without having a closed mind about the outcome. So I think that's something that's really important to me, that we don't have an agenda as academics. I know we're going to talk about the role of academics later on also, but let me just say, as academics, I think what we need to focus on is to not be prejudiced, keep an open mind, and if we find new results or results that contradict our previous results, we should still embrace them. So I think, but obviously staying within our research area, but without having kind of preconceived notions.
Thanks so much. Yes. Next, I will turn our attention to the research related to this topic. Okay, and we wrote a paper measuring the economic premiums green housing in the property market in Tokyo. This paper, the title is a green luxury goods. We are focusing on the condominium market in Tokyo with a green labels. And in this study, we are able to identify which type of the household pays the premium for the environment by considering the characteristics such as the income level of the households. And it's very interesting for me. And the property investors is interested in the economic premiums on prices, and the prices is determined by the present value equations. So, and if the green rent in the green building increased by the green, so the prices or investment return is increased. If the discount rate or risk premium reduced from the green building, investment return is increased. So our researchers is focusing on the green premiums in the prices or green premiums in the rent or green premiums or discount premiums for the discount rate. So please introduce your research. How far has the research progressed in the academic world? Would you please introduce your series of the research to Japanese expert in the simplified manner? Okay.
Yes, thanks, Jero. So I think the valuation formula, or it's also basically analogous to the NOI formula that you just showed, is a very good starting point also for explaining the nuts and bolts of our research, and I think of a lot of researchers in this area, because it contains all the different elements that we're focusing on. So I think, as you said, we're starting out with the rent, so the numerator of the equation. So looking at the rent premiums in various markets, that kept us busy for many, many years, looking at all the different markets there are to study around the world, compiling empirical evidence of a green premium. In quite a few cases, we didn't find a green premium. Now in Japan, we did when we did our study together, but there were other markets. For example, an early study we did in 2012 in the UK using UK data, UK commercial data, where it wasn't really clear cut that there was a premium. So, but still, it's something, as I said, that needs reporting. And as always in empirical research, you don't find 100% of the time, you don't find confirmation, but you can paint a picture with a lot of studies and piecing together the empirical evidence. And I think our study of the Tokyo condominium market was one such important piece. So this is kind of the YIT, so the numerator, the rental income, where we have a pretty good understanding now, fast forwarding to 2021, of the of the rental income drivers, and in which cases we actually find a green premium and where we don't find a green premium. And then next, we turned our attention to prices and the risk premium. So the RPI and the PIT in this equation. Now, the risk premium has always turned out to be somewhat elusive. And I would like to tell you why. I think it's because this, anything to do with cap rates, risk premiums, and so forth is so sensitive. I'm not sure if you would agree with me that to decompose it into all the signals that go into it with very noisy, usually noisy empirical data is a very tricky subject. So I think it's much easier to detect the effect of greenness or sustainability in rents or prices than it is in cap rates or risk premia or anything like that. So I think that's why we see a lot more studies on rents and prices than we see on risk premiums. And then the other thing I would say, and not to forget in that formula, is the G, so the growth in rental income. And there has been some research on it, but maybe not enough. But what I think comes through in a lot of the literature, also in my research, is that part of the price premium is also due to future growth prospects. So there is this word future proof or future proofing of buildings, right? That leads to that basically that the price has above average rental growth baked into it, because green buildings have typically a longer lifespan, although there is some debate around that. But you could say they are more able to adapt to future changes. So in regulations, for example, we see that a lot of governments require higher and higher standards, not just of the new construction sector, but also of the existing building stock. And as green buildings are able to meet these challenges that are ahead of us, they'll also outperform in terms of the G. So that's at least the stylized or theoretical thinking framework that we're trying to test with data and to see what happens when we actually apply real market data to this formula and to our kind of construct, theoretical construct around it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your research. And I like to turn to the future works in this field. We had a big earthquakes in 2023 in Tokyo area, Kanto or Tokyo area. And we had a big earthquake in 1995 in Kansai area, West area. At that time, I was in the Kobe city. So, and the hotel I stayed, this is a city hall here, city hall. I had an appointment with the city hall, Kobe city at the 10 a.m. and the city planning division is on these floors. If this earthquake attacked around 5 hours later, maybe I was not here. And we also had a big earthquake 2011. Tsunami attacked this area. Around 22,000 people passed away. So recently we had a big flood in the south area in Japan in last years. So IPD, Investment Property Data Bank, and IPF, and the Investment Property Forum interested in the sustainabilities in the property market. Our friend, Paul McManara, who led the project at the United Nations about the responsible property investment. And he also sent a questionnaire to the landlords and ask about the sustainable condition of the sustainable property market. So he identified the core sustainability of the property market is like building quality, building accessibility, and energy efficiency, and water efficiency, and waste management, and flood risk. And he requested me us. I was advisor at the IPD at that time. We compared the investment return based on the sustainable properties and other non-sustainable properties as a total return in each sector at that time. So I understand flood risk is important for the sustainable property market at that time, maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago, or 15 years ago. So, and could you tell us about the latest research tendencies in this field related to the ESG? And young researchers at the Tokyo is coming here. And what do you think are the main research topics in this field? Finally, could you tell us about the role as academics to promote the low carbon society or sustainable society? Please, Franz.
Thanks, Shira. That's good questions. I'll try to tackle them one by one. And there are various ways of structuring it, I guess. And let me just say there is no shortage of interesting questions there. And what strikes me is when I started out and when we first met on the Isle of Skye and now 13, 14 years ago, some people still viewed this whole topic area with suspicion and said, oh, it's something, yeah, that maybe will be researched for a few years and will then get exhausted pretty much. All the questions will be answered and then we'll move on to completely different areas. It's not the case. I think everyone can confirm that. On the contrary, what we find is more and more questions. For every question you ask, you get 5 new ones, basically, as is the case, I think, with all the good research fields, regardless of the discipline. So I think there are more questions, fascinating questions than ever, and also more researchers than ever in our field. And thirdly, I would also say, luckily, also there is more data than ever that we could harness to actually answer these questions. So when we started out, we really had just the minimum that you need to test some basic hypotheses. Nowadays, we can test a lot more. And I think that's also to the advantage of testing hypotheses and doing research around ESG and property markets, especially ESG, which I guess by nature is mainly focusing at the company and the portfolio levels, where you need a lot of data, right? So if you look at the building level, maybe sometimes you can get away with less data, but at the company and portfolio level, you need a lot of data. And I think that's a positive development. And that's also allowed research in this area at this level, the portfolio and the company level, to proliferate. Now, what do I see as the main trends in ESG and property markets? Starting from the top, from the company and portfolio level, I would say it's the question of how do you align your portfolio and your company with the goals of the Paris Agreement or other policy goals. And those goals are moving targets. As we've seen, a lot of countries, governments around the world, they're tightening up their carbon budgets. They're becoming more ambitious also. Just to give you one example from the UK, now we've got over a third of the biggest UK companies signed up to a carbon neutral pledge by 2050. So that's gathering momentum. We also see a lot of changes in the ambitions to become net zero at the country level. And obviously, that's a question for that every company needs to ask itself: how aligned am I with these goals as they become more ambitious? And I think as research can help address this question. First of all, to map the space, where am I with regard to the benchmark of where I need to be in terms of alignment, but also what are the little things in the underlying assets that I can do to reposition myself to be aligned. And previously, I think, and this is one of the big trends, previously we've just relied on bits and pieces. For example, green building labels, as important as they are, they don't give us the full picture, right? So we really need to drill very deeply into the actual underlying metrics. So defining metrics for ESG that show us the material impact of the operation of companies and portfolios becomes more important than just saying, okay, some expert looked at it and they put a label on it and I believe then that's good to go. So we need a whole host of metrics. And I think ESG research and strategy has made huge progress in actually getting down to business and defining these metrics. What are the standards? What are the metrics? How do we define them? Where are the thresholds? So I think that's a big trend, and that's something in the analytics that academics can and other researchers can play a big role in. Now that's the ESG level. I think the second part of my question, or of my answer to your question, would be the asset level or the building level. And there I would see, four main trends. And it would be fascinating to discuss this with you, but I'm not sure we have time for this. But first of all, as we said, the sustainability of the building.
Yeah.
So this encompasses things like energy efficiency, but it shouldn't just focus on the operation phase of a building's life cycle, right? It should also take into account, at least to a certain extent, the entire life cycle of the building, from cradle to cradle, as the life cycle assessment slogan goes. So starting with materials, building materials, where are they sourced? What is their carbon footprint? Then looking at the operational phase and so forth. So sustainability is the first factor, and that's going to continue well into the future, I think. The second one, I think that's gained more prominence is health and well-being, right? So health and well-being as a factor that's integral to the success, also the financial and economic success of a building. I think the current pandemic has brought that into really sharp focus, that the built environment is really important for health and well-being outcomes. So infectious diseases is what's on everyone's mind at the moment. And buildings can play a role. We all know that, social distancing, for example, but it's just one example of many where the shape and the configuration of the built environment can contribute to good outcomes, or not so good outcomes if these parameters are not within a range that is acceptable. So health and well-being, meaning clean air in the buildings. So indoor, the quality of the indoor air, clean water, natural daylight, for example, views, but also more and more healthy building materials that do not give rise to all sorts of health conditions later on. So using natural materials, also being very meticulous in choosing materials that we surround ourselves with, given how much time we spend inside buildings and are exposed to potentially harmful substances. So that's, I think, another big trend. The third one, again, I think something that got catalyzed by the current pandemic is flexibility. That we plan a lot smarter and not just do a building that is fit for purpose for a number of years and is then discarded, demolished, but something that can adapt flexibly. So for example, now that we'll probably have different in the office sector will have different configurations of a typical office, right? Even going forward, buildings should be able to be flexible around that. So that is another trend. And a fourth trend that I will see going forward would be the role of technology and innovation in all this.
Yes.
As an enabler of all the three things that I said before, so sustainability, health and well-being, and flexibility, how can it be achieved? And I think a big role for that is technology and innovation. So the obvious examples that come to mind is smart building sensors, for example, air quality sensors, also regulations of building systems that lead to lower carbon emissions, but also a more health and well-being and more flexibility in terms of where does the building need the resources on a day-to-day, but also on a week-to-week, month-to-month, and so forth basis. So I think technology has a big role to play. But I would like to say, if I may, to me, technology and innovation is not just high-tech, fancy sensors all over the place, measuring billions of data points every second. I think that has a role to play, but it can also be more simpler innovations, right? It doesn't always have to be high-tech, but innovation, and that's maybe sometimes forgotten, can also be along really simple ideas, right? So for example, with building materials, I'm by no means an expert in that, but I'm fascinated to hear what innovations there are around building materials, for example, in things like self-healing concrete or self-healing building materials, or solar panels that are made from algae and other organic materials instead of the rare earths that are also a finite resource. So I think a lot of innovation doesn't have to be high-tech. It can be organic, and it can come from simple ideas. Yes, but I probably should leave it at that for this question.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Franz. Our friend Shichi-Chen, who was working at the Tsinghua University, we read her papers published from the European Economic Journal. So when I visited to your office, you introduced her report for her papers. Now, I and Shichi are collaborating at the MIT. I'm also a research affiliate at the Center for Real Estate Studies at the MIT, and the MIT is focusing on the high-tech technology, new technology, or IoT or other technology in the buildings. And he wrote the very interesting paper related to the healthy buildings. I've sent her papers after these discussions. Thank you, Franz. And from here, I'd like to discuss the role of the industry. Okay, the United Nations propose the principle of the responsible property investment I mentioned before. And my friend, or maybe you know your friend, Dr. Paul McNamara, and led this project. And he was living, maybe he's living in the St. Albans, and I was living in London. He was a neighbor at the St. Albans. Yeah. So I very well know his family. And they focus on the buildings and the construction sectors, which amount for nearly 40% of the total energy related to CO2 emissions and 36% of the total energy use worldwide. The global building floor area is expected to double by 2050 or 2050, which could increase the energy demand and related greenhouse gases or GHG emissions for constructions. However, the building sector has the highest potential to mitigate GHG emissions in a cost-effective manner. And net cost saving and economic gains are possible through the implementation of existing technologies, policies, and building designs the works of the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative on property investing was undertaken by the property working group. Academics has a leading role of the driving innovation in the possible responsible property investing by the facilitating access to the relevant information and best practice and collaboratively developing the necessary tools to enable property investors and professionals to systematically apply and integrate ESG criteria into the investment and lending decisions. And questions: what should be the role of the property investment industry to contribute to ESG or sustainable development goals? What type of the behavior change is needed? What do you think?
It's a very good question. I think we're already seeing, and we've already seen a lot of behavior change from companies. And I would even go further and say in a lot of respects, what I'm seeing now in 2021 is actually companies not just kind of responding to pressure from, let's say, government, NGO, but actually taking a proactive role and pushing the envelope in terms of, especially in the field of climate change and mitigating climate change. So actually being more ambitious than what government rules and regulations set out. And I think that's a really exciting development. So companies being in the driver's seat, being pioneers really, and saying, okay, these are the kind of, that's the legal framework that we need to fulfill. How can we go beyond that? How can we get there even faster in terms of getting to net zero? And I think there are some really good and, to me, encouraging and inspiring examples of companies that have said, okay, we want to go much further than the legal standards and the rules and regulations, and we can actually show and prove that we can still be a profitable business, even setting our bar really high in terms of aspirations for the ESG. So all three dimensions, and also the sustainable development goals that the United Nations have set up. So I think just thinking, kind of looking from an academic perspective at the industry, I think what's really important is to actually not just do more and more in terms of additive. Okay, now we're also adding on health and well-being, for example, because as you said, things like design, construction, operating and maintenance expenses are only about less than 10% of building expenses, and 90% is actually personnel, people actually working, salaries and so forth. So that's a huge lever in the ESG equation. But to me, what's important is, and what I would like to do more research on is, how do companies actually detect and resolve clashes between the E, S, and G, right? Because it all sounds good to add on more and more things. We want to be environmentally friendly. We want to do this in a socially equitable way. And we also want good governance. But sometimes there are trade-offs between, or clashes between the E and the S and the G. So just to give you one example, for health and well-being, it would probably be good for each of us to have big offices, right? A lot of space. But at the same time, we know that space per person is actually usually comes with more carbon emissions, a larger carbon footprint. So there you see right away kind of a conflict between the two. And there are lots of those, I think, where there is kind of a clash that needs to be resolved. And that's something that companies need to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
But also something that academics, I think, can help with in terms of identifying and resolving. So yeah, I guess that would be my answer to what the industry what the role of industry can be.
Thanks so much. And I understand the importance of the role of the academics to achieve the sustainable society and the industries. So introduce the flood risk in Japan and several disasters. Sustainability is more importantly for the future property market. So you wrote a very interesting paper focused on the flood risk or sea level rise in the Melbourne market. Could you introduce your research again related to this topic?
Right. So the research that I looked at was specifically sea level rise.
Yeah.
And the empirical example that we used was Australia, and more specifically the Melbourne area in Australia. And Australia, a lot of its population, I think not unlike Japan, a lot of its population is concentrated in areas that might be subject to future sea level rise. And I think that's also not a coincidence that countries like Australia and Japan are at the forefront of recognizing this as a problem and working on solutions, because they're possibly more exposed than other countries. And so they feel the effects earlier than possibly other countries. Just in terms of the percentage of population that's exposed to it, and also the percentage of buildings and cities that will be exposed to the effects of climate change. So that's why I thought Australia is a good place to start. Japan obviously is another one, and I'm glad to see that you're also doing research on Japan at the same time. So what we did was we got hold of a really fascinating data set that was very comprehensive. It had all the value drivers in there from a data set of that appraisers put together, and it had a lot of variables that are usually missing in price and hedonic analysis. So things like building, what condition is the building in, a condition rating. It had a detailed list of all the building materials and so forth, detailed information on location and so forth, and the usual ones. We then used a digital elevation model to work out which buildings are currently threatened by floods, so are in flood zones, and which ones will be affected in the future. And obviously, we don't know exactly kind of what sea level rise will be, but we worked with different scenarios. So which buildings will be subject to flooding under sea level rise with a high degree of certainty, where is it likely, where is it less likely, and so forth. So defining different scenarios. Long story short, for the Melbourne area, we didn't really find conclusive evidence of a price discount for those buildings that will be affected by sea level rise in the future. I know that some other research, for example, in the US, has found the opposite, that people are actually starting to price this sea level rise into transaction prices, to a certain extent also appraisals, but our evidence was inconclusive. Now, we were thinking about why that is. One possibility is that we're really looking at a limited area within Melbourne. So we didn't look at the entire coastline of Australia. We looked at a relatively homogeneous area in Melbourne. So maybe the outcome would be different if we broadened our study area and really looked at the entire coastline of Australia. The other kind of suspicion that we have why we don't find a discount is information. And I should have said at the beginning, one of the research topics that I'm interested in is also the role of information provision in bringing about sustainability and enhancing ESG. So in Australia, it's not usual, and I think that's the case in a lot of countries, that buyers or sellers for that matter are aware of their future risk, right? You will be told that you're in a current flood area. That's a piece of information that you have. but you won't know what's ahead in the future. And yeah, it's a bit of a policy debate. Should we actually give all buyers this piece of information, even if there is still uncertainty around it, right? We can't say, oh, your property will be underwater in 50 or 70 years time. That's very hard to say with absolute certainty, but at least increase awareness and make information available to people. And maybe then we'll see a more decisive and measurable price impact from areas that will be affected by future sea level rise. But yeah, so that's our research in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you. And several years ago, you sent me your papers about these papers, updated these papers. So, and we checked the similar data. We found these similar data in Tokyo metropolitan area. Tokyo metropolitan government disclosed the expected flood risk. This is a map with the expected flood risk, and we plotted the property prices on this map. Okay, a lot of the single-family houses in the flood area were high-risk area. So we ran the headrick regression. We ran regressions using this data. We found the discount rate from the expected flood risk. So I would like to promote this research with you in future. After these discussions, I will introduce to you Mr. Baba and Yuzo Shimizu. They promoted this research. Okay, and thank you. And next, this is final questions. And what are the most important factors in the property investment market in the future? Please provide a general opinion at the end, along with the message to you, expert from the property investment players or academics in Japan. Please, Franz.
Thank you very much. What I would say, and bearing in mind that I'm an academic, not an industry professional who deals with the market on a day-to-day basis, but somebody watching, let's say, closely from the sidelines and keeping a close eye on the market without actually being a player myself, I would still stick to the 4 things I said. So sustainability, making sure that your investment, whether it's at the asset level or company level, is aligned with sustainability goals, keeping in mind health and well-being, flexibility, technology innovation. It's a long agenda. It's an ambitious agenda, and each company needs to place itself on where it wants to be, whether it wants to be at the forefront as a pioneer, or rather sit back and watch what others do first. The other thing I would say is get used to having more and more data. So obviously it's almost become a cliche to say we're in the age of big data, but I think there is a lot more to come. And real estate typically is a lagging industry in terms of data and data provision and data sharing, especially.
Yeah.
But not just having a lot of data at the building level, but also the company level, but having the analytic power to actually to make sense of all those streams of data that are coming at us. So it requires a lot of drilling down and a lot of analytic capabilities. And the other thing that I would say is a key driver of property investment markets is to think around the problem of scaling up from small kind of building level solutions to actually a whole company or the whole industry. Because we've seen, I mean, another term that's being bandied about a lot is disruption, right? Disruption in all sorts of industries that we've seen. Uber, for example, has disrupted the taxi business and so forth. So the question to me is, what are the big disruptors in the property investment market, right? I don't think we've seen, to be honest, a lot of disruption yet, but it's about to come. And to me, it's about to come from technology and innovation. Again, keeping in mind that it's not just the high tech, but also smaller solutions. But connected to that, how do we scale up from neat little ideas around some of the things that I said, like building materials and so forth? How do we scale that up to an entire company or the entire industry? And I think we've got the tools to actually make that happen a lot more rapidly than in previous times. So if you think back 100 years or several hundred years ago, it took a very long time for changes in the built environment to actually spread out. Nowadays, I think this can be done a lot more quickly. And I think that's a trend. The sheer speed of actually propagating innovations and doing things better, also enabled by technology. That's something that the industry needs to be aware of.
Thank you. Thank you, Franz. Today I learned a lot from you. High cost, which is a consideration for ESG in property investment, will gradually reduce investment returns in the short term. Thus, we have been studying how to maximize the return on investment in the long run. For example, in the case of the environment-friendly building, it is expected that the long-term investment value of the property will increase due to the increasing the rent and reduced risk, I think. Many studies have been conducted internationally, including ours, but have such studies really promoted the ESG in property investment? Properties such as houses, residential, and offices and retail are deeply involved in household consumption and corporate production activity. As properties are important living and production resources and have a long service life, it is natural to design a way of the coexistence from a long-term perspective as a component of the society, I think, and over the next decades or centuries, as an entire world accelerates the design of the social system under the ESG philosophy, the property market will naturally follow this tendency. The debate about whether environment property has economic or investment value may be an indication that we do not understand the environment philosophy itself. Though today's conversation, I learned that it is necessary to property design of the highly sustainable property investment market or highly sustainable society, I think. Thank you, Franz, coming to these discussions. I'll stop the recording. Okay, that's all.
Okay, thank you very much, Chihiro.
Thank you.